So I'll get a good Chodesh. It's day 2 of Rosh Chodesh, but that would be day 1 of Adar. Yes, 30th of Shvat, making it the first day of Rosh Chodesh. But today, of course, is Aleph Adar, Aleph, day 1 of the first Adar. So we're going to begin now the Gemara, which is on Chav Daled Amud Aleph on 24a, which comments on the Gemara. Which comments on the opening of the Mishnah. So the opening of the Mishnah, I'm just pulling up on the screen here. I went to the wrong page. The opening of the Mishnah is on 23b. Chav Gimel Amud Beis. That's the opening of the Mishnah on the bottom. So let's look at the opening of the Mishnah again before we get to the Gemara, so we understand the Gemara's analysis. So as I mentioned in the past already, this chapter, the beginning of the chapter here, delves into the status of the people who are involved in the Sotah proceeding and who qualifies to be a Sotah. The status of the husband, the status of the wife, and the status of their relationship. After having completed a detailed description of the actual proceeding itself, the Mishnah gets to who qualifies and who doesn't qualify. Sorry?
No, I'm sorry.
So the first thing the Mishnah tells us is that in order to qualify as a Sotah, the marriage has to be a complete and full marriage, to the exclusion of 2 elements, 2 different types of relationships. And they are, it's the opening of the Mishnah on the bottom of Chav Gimel Amud Beis 23b, the Mishnah. We're going back just to look at the Mishnah so we can see the Gemara's analysis. Just the first 2 lines. The Mishnah reads, Arusa, an engaged woman, a betrothed woman, right? So as I explained before, there are 2 stages to the marriage. Today, in our wedding ceremonies, we combine both together. But essentially, there's the ring. The ring is betrothal. That is to say, the betrothal is like a solidified legal commitment to each other. And what happens is she now becomes forbidden to marry anybody else because she's now his. Right? The word here it's arusa, which means betrothed. The other word is kedushin, which means sanctified or exclusive. Right? But they're not married yet. She's just been separated from everybody else.
And just
Committed.
Is it kind of like before you put the offering into the vessel? Consecrated.
Oh yeah, so 2 levels of consecration. Yeah, I was thinking of like when you buy something, you have first escrow, you're in contract, and then you buy. Right? It's a pledge to purchase.
Right.
So this is a pledge to marriage, if you will. So this is stage 1.
When you dedicate something to the temple.
That's what you refer to. You dedicate something to the temple.
Before it's on the altar.
And then before, that's right.
There's still some level of.
That's right. There's like stages in dedication.
To it, but not full.
Yeah. So similar kind of thing.
Where you can redeem, right?
That's right.
Right.
That's right. Very good point. So these are the stages. Yeah, we learned about this, right? There's 2 stages in dedication.
Yeah.
Yeah. So similar kind of thing. So they're intended to each other, but not married yet. And then there's the nisuyin, there's the marriage, which is the chuppah ceremony, the second part of the wedding ceremony, which is we do a ring and we read the ketubah. The reading of the ketubah is to separate between the 2 parts.
That's called nisuyin.
Nisuyin, marriage. So the chuppah. So there's the ring, and then there's the blessings that come after, and then they go into seclusion, and that's the marriage is done.
Same as kiddushin?
No, kedushin is the first part.
Is the first part.
Kedushin is the betrothal, and nisuyin is the complete marriage, the chuppah.
What's erusin?
Erusin is the same thing as kedushin.
Okay, that's what I got mixed up.
Erusin and kedushin are the same. Nisuyin and chuppah are the same.
Okay.
Okay, so erusin kedushin is the betrothal, commitment, and then the nisuyin and chuppah is the actual marriage. So said the Mishnah, arusa, one who is betrothed, not married yet. So this woman, this relationship, not a full marriage yet. And likewise, another version of someone who's not fully married is shemeres yavam. Someone who's waiting for her brother-in-law. So, right, this is the unique law of a married man who dies, unfortunately, childless. And she is now intended to marry one of his brothers. Torah commands that one of the brothers marry his widowed sister-in-law, and that way they reestablish the lost brother's home because he doesn't have any children. Now, this marriage rolls over from the first marriage. So they don't have to do kiddushin, they don't have to betroth this widow and the brother-in-law, and they don't even have to do chuppah. All they have to do is consummate the marriage. He just has to be physically intimate with her. And as we're going to learn, whether intentionally, whether he realized it was his sister-in-law, let's say he didn't think it was his sister-in-law. He thought it was a random girl on the street.
Right.
And it turns out it is a sister-in-law. They're married. Because all it's required is consummation. That's it. Because the marriage rolls over from the brother. So all the legalities of the brother's marriage that happened at the chuppah, with how many years it was earlier, rolls over to the brother. And no need for any ceremony. So the sages enacted that they should do a certain ceremony so that it doesn't seem, inconsequential, doesn't seem like so frivolous. But technically speaking, from biblical law, all they have to do is consummate the marriage.
There is intent, though.
No, it doesn't have to be intent. It's like, even if he thought that she was a random girl on the street, they're still married because the consummation happened.
Then
And that's it.
Any person that somebody might have been with.
Only his brother-in-law, only her brother-in-law, only her deceased,
only in that situation.
only the deceased, because in this case, all the legalities of the marriage of the first brother rolls into the second marriage.
And that's the only way to do it.
And that's it.
Right.
So we have a ceremony this one called Maimer, what they do, right? And he takes the stead of his brother. Yeah. So these are two different versions in which the marriage is not complete, either because betrothal and the marriage didn't come through, or because she is the rollover marriage of her deceased husband is pending. It's pending her brother-in-law's consummation. If he consummates, then the marriage is rolled, extends, and if not, they go through the chalitza process. Now she's free to marry anybody. If they go through this whole chalitza process, which is not an actual divorce, but there's this whole system where she takes a shoe off his leg, and a whole process, but not a regular bill of divorce. Okay. So those are the two models for non-complete marriages. And in both these cases, said the Mishnah, loy shoisais, she doesn't drink the Sotah waters. The loy note is ksuba, but she doesn't get her ketubah. She forfeits the ketubah, which means the Mishnah is saying like this: if the betrothed husband warned his betrothed intended, or if their brother-in-law warned his deceased brother's wife, the one who he's warned her, right? Let's say he warned her. They didn't marry yet. He didn't consummate the marriage. And the betrothed husband didn't take her to the chuppah yet. He just gave her a ring. Right? We clear the situation?
Yeah.
And then he warns her, don't seclude yourself with X-man, someone else. And then she betrays that warning and does seclude herself. So she's a Sotah. But
even if the seclusion doesn't lead?
Well, we don't know if it'll lead to anything, right? That's the point. We don't know what the seclusion, the whole point of the Sotah is, we don't know what happened behind closed doors, so we should drink the water to determine, right? So we don't know what happened behind closed doors. But he warned her. Now what happens? Says the Mishnah, he cannot take her to the temple to drink the water and go through the proceeding of the Sotah. Why? Because the Torah explicitly states that he takes his wife. She's not his wife yet. So she doesn't qualify, she doesn't satisfy the verse to qualify for this proceeding. Yeah? Clear? But she forfeits the right to her ketubah.
Does that mean it's an automatic divorce?
Oh, that's what we're going to get to in a moment.
Okay.
Get to in a moment.
Seems like it would.
We'll get to that in a moment. So that's the Gemara's analysis, which is why I'm wording it in such a way to lead you to that point, because that's the Gemara's analysis in a moment, right? So, let's just recap what it says here. So she doesn't drink the water, even she was warned, and she transgressed the warning. She secluded herself with a man that her intended, either her deceased husband's brother or her betrothed. Those are the two scenarios, right? Warned her not to seclude herself with a certain man. She did. He cannot take her to the temple to go through the Sotah proceedings and determine what happened behind closed doors because she is not his wife. And the Torah says he takes his wife. But on the other hand, she forfeits the right to her ketubah, as we explained, because the ketubah is a financial burden on him that he shouldn't divorce her. In this case, where he has serious grounds to suspect her for infidelity, why should he be bound financially to the marriage? So she forfeits her ketubah.
So there's a strong presumption of guilt on her part?
There's a strong presumption of guilt,
Because
is a good way of putting it, but I don't want to say a strong presumption of guilt so much as an actual suspicion. She's obviously a suspicious girl. I mean, her husband told her not to, and she went anyway.
Right.
Assuming that there's no affair, there's no a malicious intent. Let's just assume, right? Because the court will determine if there's malicious intent on the part of the husband, right? But let's just say there's no malicious intent on the part of the husband.
Okay.
He's genuinely concerned about her relationship with a certain guy. Yeah. Assuming. Okay. So now to Robert's point, now let's go to the Gemara on Chavdal and Medalev 24a. We clear so far?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Gemara says like this. Now you see that on 24a, Chavdal and Medalev, the big ball Gimel Mem, the Gemara says as follows. Mishta, drinking, hu deloy shase. That she cannot do. The Mishnah said, because these two women are not actually married to their intended yet. One is betrothed and the other is only pending, waiting for her deceased husband's marriage to roll over into the brother-in-law once he consummates. But at the moment, the marriage is not solidified yet for two different reasons. One is because it's only betrothal, scenario A. Scenario B, because the marriage of her brother hasn't been consummated in the brother-in-law yet. I'm sorry, the marriage of her husband hasn't been consummated by her brother-in-law yet, right? So Mishta Shasa, she cannot drink the water. But her kinui mekanala. But the Mishnah implies that he does warn her. What does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah doesn't say, look, because they're not married, therefore the whole site is off. And if the whole site is off, his warning is of no value. That's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says he cannot take her to the temple to drink. But there's a whole part of the site, the proceeding that happens before you get to the temple to drink. Namely, he's got to warn her in the presence of witnesses. That the Mishnah didn't say he can't do, which means he can do it. Following? Which means his warning is a valid warning. It's only that he can't take her to the temple. Which is why, because
the verse
the verse says the verse says the husband takes his wife to the temple. And this is not his wife yet. But the warning that he's allowed to do, that he has the right to do, and the warning is a valid warning, which is why she loses her ketubah. She loses her ketubah because his warning was a valid warning. And therefore, when he betrays her and secludes herself with this man about which he warned her, it was a valid betrayal of a valid warning, and thus she loses her ketubah, which means, therefore, he can divorce her. On the grounds of serious suspicion. If the warning itself had no value, and the Mishnah said, look, the whole Sotah does not account unless you're fully married. And because the whole Sotah doesn't count, the warning was of no value. So if the warning is of no value, he can't divorce her. I'm going to just pick it up and press 6.
Sorry.
I don't think anybody's in the office. Just press 6, yeah. So had the Mishnah said, because you're not married, therefore the whole Sotah is off. And if the whole Sotah is off, you cannot even warn her. So the warning was of no value. If the warning is of no value, then she still retains her ketubah, and they can still go through with the marriage, right? Because there's no real suspicion, because the warning was, she didn't go against anything. But now that the Mishnah said, no, you can't take her to the temple to drink. And she does lose her ketubah, which means the warning is a valid warning. So in other words, it's not as if the whole Sotah law is off. It's not. The Sotah law applies. It's the drinking ceremony proceeding that's off. But they're still connected enough that his warning is a value.
It seems funny because the drinking was the part that determined whether or not she was guilty.
That's right.
And that's
So
being bypassed.
that's right.
There's a leniency being placed in here for the benefit of the husband.
There's a leniency here in the place of the benefit of the husband.
I think, right? Because
Yeah, on the other hand, on one hand, you're right. There's a leniency in favor of the husband.
Stepping that was the determining factor at which
She's stripped of her, that's right. She's stripped of her ability to prove her innocence, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because, right, she can't prove her innocence. And now the husband has the upper hand, he can divorce her and she loses the ketubah.
Right.
That's a good point.
But
Conversely, because she's not fully married, which means her betrayal is not as bad, right? Because they're not fully married. It's pretty bad, as we're going to learn soon. It's a serious betrayal, right? They're intended, whatever it is. They're betrothed or they're intended, but the betrayal is not as deep because the marriage hasn't been solidified.
right, and maybe procedural due process has been sort of brought down a couple of notches.
That's number one. And number two,
because they're not really.
that's right. So number one, we're not going to invest so much in determining the truth, perhaps, but also we spare her the humiliation.
That's the upside for her.
The Sotah is very valuable to her because it will prove her innocence if she's indeed innocent, right? She'll drink the water and she'll survive and she'll get all the blessings. On the other hand, it's quite humiliating. We drag to the temple, right, to tear her clothing, and her hair. They're giving her this whole speech. There's a crowd watching. So
Right.
it works, it plays to both their advantages if the Sotah doesn't happen. Which is why until now we learned that we're constantly trying to avoid it. Because we don't want to erase God's name. So we're hoping she's going to admit.
Right.
Or we're hoping he's going to back out.
Around the court, right?
That's right. They take her around the court, they walk around the temple. It's quite a humiliating process that I would not wish upon anybody. So it works to her advantage too. Okay. So it says the Gemara like this. Mem, hey, mem. You see those three letters there? For you, it's probably spelled out, Mina, Hani, Mili. But for Meir, it's going to say mem, hey, mem.
Yeah.
That stands for Mina, Hani, Mili.
These words.
From where, Mina, from where do you know these words? Meaning these words you just said, based on the Mishnah. That his warning is a valid warning, even though they're not fully married. And because he's not fully married, he cannot take her to the temple to drink the Sotah waters. But he can warn her, and the warning is valid to the point that she loses a ketubah and he can divorce her. Right? Not just divorce her. Rashi says he may not be with her. Because a husband ought not to be with a woman that betrayed him. So he has to divorce her. And she loses a ketubah. So from where do we know this? Says the Gemara. Tells us the Gemara like this. Tan Rabbanon, for our sages taught, Mishnaic age text. When the Torah introduces the law of the Sotah, right? The law of the Sotah, we looked at the text way at the beginning. Maybe we'll revisit that tomorrow when we get into details. But the verse of the Sotah is in Bamidbar. Bamidbar is Numbers, chapter 5, the second half of chapter 5, and it begins in verse 12. So the verse opens up with the following words. God says to Moses, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people. Va'amarta, and you shall tell aleim to them. It's a double expression. Speak to the Jewish people and tell them. The verse could have just said, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, speak to the people of Israel, such and such is the law of the Sotah. But the verse doubles the expression. Daber el b'nei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people, va'amarta aleim, and you shall inform them. You shall say to them, double expression of speaking. To teach you that even though all the details of the law do not apply to everybody, but in some regard, they do apply to everybody. In other words, the double expression, speak to them, is there to expand the audience to beyond those who are capable of going through with the entire Sotah proceeding. Le rabbis, therefore, this comes to include, says the Gemara, Arusa, the betrothed one, B'Shemeres Yavam, and the one who is waiting for her brother-in-law to consummate the marriage, Likinoi, so that they can be warned. In other words, like this. When the Torah itself describes the law of the Sotah, when the Torah itself describes the drinking of the water, the Torah says, husband takes his wife. Okay, so we know clearly that if it's not his wife, he cannot take her to the temple to drink the Sotah water. Good. So we've limited the scope of the message. In other words, when Moshe is speaking and relaying the message, it's limited to a married man and a married woman, right? Because the Torah says he takes his wife, right? So, which would mean then, when God says, speak to the children of Israel, who are these children of Israel? The married men. But then, when the Torah adds and says, when God adds and says, speak to the Jewish people and say to them, adding those words and say to them, Hashem is telling Moshe, it's true the crowd is limited to married men, but expand it a little bit to more people, which is why I'm doubling my expression and saying, say to them twice, to add more people to the crowd. So that even though they don't qualify for the full Sotah law, but some part of the Sotah law does apply to them. And this is the engaged man, the engaged woman, and the one who's waiting for her brother-in-law. That even though they aren't part of the Sotah proceeding in the full sense, because they cannot be taken to the temple because they aren't married, but some part of the Sotah does apply to them. Namely, he can warn her against misbehaving, and if she violates that vow, that warning, not the vow, I'm sorry, if she violates the warning, she loses her ketubah and a divorce. Is that clear?
It's coming to teach us that it's when the husband doesn't have that full right to bring her to drink the water, he still has rights
to warn
to
her
warn her, and
correct.
that'll be a deterrence on her, not if in these situations.
not to misbehave.
not
That's
to
right.
misbehave.
That's correct.
And
So
to get away with it, because if this law wasn't in place,
she would say, I'm only engaged, no big deal. I can
yeah, and it
That's
would
right.
be a circle of craziness.
That's a good point. If Torah allowed, so the Torah may not want to take her through the whole humiliation because she's not fully married. But at the same time, Torah wants to put up a system in place where she doesn't take it lightly to play around
She could understand this law and be able to go from this guy to this guy, just with a betrothal.
and say, no big deal, because I'm only betrothed.
She'd have ketubah.
Very good point.
And,
Very good point.
protects both sides.
It's a very good point. So protecting him against her misbehaving because she thinks it's no big deal because we're only engaged.
Right.
Torah says, hold on a second. You may not go through the whole humiliation, but you will lose your ketubah, and he retains the right to warn you and divorce you should you misbehave during engagement. That's right. So by the Torah adding these extra words, repeating it, speak to the Jewish people and say to them, what the Torah is telling you is expand the audience a little bit. That this law applies not just married men, but also to intended.
Let's bring those in too.
But not for the full law,
No.
because the full law, it says he takes his wife to the temple. This is not his wife. But the warning, that does apply. So he could warn his betrothed or his intended, and then all the laws of the warning will take effect. Namely, she loses her ketubah, and if she violates that warning, and he then can't be with her because she is suspect, and thus they would divorce.
That's to protect all parties.
And thus all parties are protected. Yes, very good. So tomorrow we're going to get into, so now we know that the intended and the engaged are part of the warning. The next stage is to zero into the verse which excludes them from the actual proceeding. So I mentioned before, the Mishnah says, because Torah says he has to take his wife to the temple, and these people aren't considered their wife, right? But the manner in which a betrothed woman is not considered the wife of a husband yet, and the manner in which the intended through the deceased husband is not considered the husband of her brother-in-law yet is very different. It's very different. So just to give you the outline where we're going, the intended, right? This woman whose husband died, and now she's intended to be with her brother-in-law. Did the brother-in-law take any action to have this woman attached to him? Nothing. His brother took action, and his brother died. So it just happened to him. So on the one hand, it's like, I did nothing to be attached to her. On the other hand, he's so attached to her that he doesn't have to do any proceeding, just has to consummate. But when it comes to betrothed, it's the reverse. By the betrothed, I took action to be married to her. On the other hand, I have to go through chuppah to marry her. I can't just be with her intimately.
Right.
I still have more proceeding to do. So on the one hand, the intended via the deceased husband is more closely attached. On the other hand, the betrothed woman is more attached. So we have to look at the verses, and we're going to see tomorrow different analysis of the verses to come to the conclusion as to which one is more closely linked to actually being married. And thus perhaps there are some opinions that will suggest that the Sotah proceeding does work for an intended, because they are actually quite closely linked, even to the point that it might be considered married, at least for the law of the Sotah. That's coming tomorrow, God willing. Okay, we're clear when we're going. It's a little bit of a loop, but I hope we're clear, yeah?
I mentioned the question earlier about whether, but it seems like you're not technically married. So is there really does he have to issue a get?
Yeah.
He does?
Yeah, it seems he has to do a get, yeah.
Do a get, right, because they do mention divorce.
Yeah.
But we're talking about this.
Let's look this up properly, but I believe so. The answer is yes.
Well, so the ketubah is given during RC?
The ketubah is given at Erison, yeah.
Okay,
At betrothal. The ketubah is given at betrothal, not a full marriage, yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, the ketubah is given at betrothal. That's right.
So.
Yeah. Okay, have a wonderful day and a good Chodesh. I know it's looping here, but I hope it was all clear. God willing, more clarity, I hope, tomorrow.
This was a good one.
Yes, you can talk, Rabbi. God bless you all. Good Chodesh. All the best.
Good day, Judge.
All the best. God bless you, Yeshua. All the best. Thanks.
Yes, Judge.